All right, everyone, let's get started. Thank you all so much for coming out to spend your Tuesday evening with us talking about psychedelics. In case you didn't know, we are alteredstatesintegration.com, where psychedelic integration meets technology. So, about us, I am Toby T, and my business partner, Elizabeth J.O., is going to be talking tonight. Some of the services we offer at Altered States Integration is peer coaching and peer support groups. Now, everything we offer is a virtual service. Everything is conducted via Zoom, like this. And then in the real world, we offer harm reduction at festivals, concerts, and art events. So I got a quick disclaimer to read, and then we'll get into our talk for the night. Altered States Integration owners, operators are not licensed therapists and do not claim to diagnose, treat, or cure diseases. Peer coaches do not assess individuals for mental health conditions, nor do they provide psychotherapy, counseling, or any other mental health service that may require board licensure. Altered States Integration does not encourage or condone the purchase, sale, or transfer of any illegal substances, nor do they encourage or condone partaking in any unlawful activities related to illegal substances. Any correspondence violating these terms to or on Altered States Integration's website or social media will be ignored, deleted, and blocked. Now, that brings us to tonight, part 3 of our 4-part Psychedelic Healing 101 course, A Beginner's Guide. Tonight, we're talking about biology and energetic considerations associated with the psychedelic experience. So with that, I'm going to give it over to our speaker tonight, Elizabeth J.O.
Great. Thank you, Toby. Welcome, healers and journeyers. Tonight, we're going to talk about some biology and some energetic considerations. We're going to look at therapeutic versus recreational terminology, and we're going to look at some warnings and considerations. Let's go ahead and start with this discussion of therapeutic versus recreational psychedelic use. Now, this is some terminology that has been around for quite some time now in the psychedelic world. A lot of people feel that this terminology is exclusive and can oftentimes make recreational use look like it's somehow not as beneficial to people, or that you're looking down on people. I've been in a bunch of different groups. Our local psychedelic club has had some rousing conversations about some alternative terminology. And frankly, I haven't come up with anything that sounds much better than this. And so I think rather than throwing away the terminology of recreational use, meaning that we're using it just for fun, that maybe we are using it for fun, and to take away from the stigma that doing psychedelics for fun is somehow less important or can't be therapeutic, like that these are not exclusive terms. Therapeutic would mean, that you're doing it specifically with some intention, with hope of some healing results. And both recreation some fun to them. There might be some laughter and some opening, some heart opening events that happen during those times. So what I'd like to propose is that maybe we stick with the term recreational for when we're using less intention, or that our intention is to have fun, and that maybe we use the term medicinal for when we're using it as a medicine, that we're being more intentional, and that we're, setting up a space to induce these situations that are going to go to deeper healing. And we're going to talk about that in our next round of webinars next week. And so that's something we can delve into a little bit deeper about. How do we make these situations be maximum healing for the time that we're in? Because many of us are not going to have multiple experiences, and we want to make sure that we get the maximum medicine out of that time and experience. So let's move on to talking a little bit about energetic medicine. Can psychedelics be described with energetic medicine? As we talked about in our first webinar, Psychedelics and entheogens have been around for a very, very long time in the world. Humans and plants have had a long relationship together, and we likely found these plants very early on. And so when those were moving through our systems, they were separate systems. So you would have a tribe that had a mushroom, or you would have a tribe in the jungle that had ayahuasca, and they weren't comparative. And so now we're in a place where we can actually compare the technology of psychedelics to itself. And that's a new place in history that we've really never had before, that we have access to these medicines and may have been able to do more than one of them. And we can look at energetic medicine. So let's look at what energetic medicine is. This is how we would have described a lot of different herbs and even animal medicine in a system of medicine. The four humors is your Greek, ancient Greek, and for a long time European way of describing energetic medicine. And you fell into a constitution. So you either had yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, or blood. Now, this is not necessarily literal. It was more of a description of what you looked like together. And they would add on things like hot or dry or wet to describe what your constitution is, meaning what you are on average, not what you're experiencing now. Because you could experience something like a fever, but maybe you're a person that runs cold. That's a constitutional thing. I run cold. That's my constitution. But when I have a sunburn or I've been exercising, yes, I'm going to feel warm, but that doesn't change that my baseline is being cold. We also have the Chinese 5-element theory, where things are compared to wood, fire, earth, water, and metal. And then we have the Ayurvedic 6 tastes, and they compare the tastes to your constitution. And then you also have the doshas that go into that medicine. So you can look some of these up. I really recommend deep study into some of these instead of just cherry picking particularly. Then we have what the modern Western herbalism model has been. And that's been a little bit more pharmacologic, in that we're looking at the tastes to interpret what kinds of compounds are in something. So as an herbalist, I was trained that if I taste something that is sweet, then I know that it's going to produce some specific reactions in the body. It's going to have some heat to it, because sugar and carbohydrates, when we're burning them, produce energy, and that it's also going to be mucilaginous, meaning it's going to make mucus. And so you might want to stay away from those if you have a particularly wet constitution. So that's kind of what energetic medicine has been up until now. Now, the system that I'm about to propose to you is my system. This is just what in my head as an herbalist makes sense. And this is open to interpretation. I really encourage you to figure out how these things are interpreted for you. And I would love to hear about any of your specific interpretations of this, or if this prompts things in you, please send us an email or a message so that we can continue this conversation. So this is the way that I've been looking at these entheogens as plants, as plant healers that are in my world. So looking at the temperature, like, is this plant cold or is it hot? The moisture, is it a wet plant or is it a dry plant? The direction of energy with psychedelics tends to be expansive, but they can be contractive. And I think it's less about contractive as in closing up and closing down, and more about the idea of whether you're looking more inward or you're looking outward to the universe. And there's a sensation of that that people have. Now, once again, that can change from person to person, but I think I'm seeing some patterns. It could also be grounding or airy. So whether it's a lot of connectedness or whether it's a lightness that comes from the experience. And then there's spirit energy. There's the masculine and the feminine that we talk about. And also, the neutral energy, the essence of both at the same time, or the absence of both at the same time. And then what I'm going to talk about with each of these entheogens is some of the shared experiences that people have had on these that seems to be typical. Now, once again, all of these medicines are going to give us, can give us a sense of wonder. They can all be expansive to our ideas. They can all be, fiery and hot when we're on a dance floor. And they can all be very introspective when we're under the microscope of our own consideration or with a therapist. So let's go ahead and go through some of these and see what you guys think. So the first one is psilocybin mushrooms. Now, I think it's really interesting that there's actually over 200 different mushrooms that produce psilocybin. And when we think about mushrooms as a plant, we think of them being in a moist, wet environment. It's going to be cool. There has to be some temperature. It's not going to be Chicago in the winter, but it will be a place that isn't in direct sun, and it's going to have a cool moistness to it. And I think that those properties come through even if the biochemistry, when we talk about mushrooms that are not psilocybin mushrooms, they have these ligands in them that are actually immune modulating and anti-inflammatory. So unless we're using an extract of these medicines, we're going to get the whole plant medicine out of this experience. It's impossible to take a mushroom and not have the other 500 constituents that make up that plant. And actually, mushrooms aren't a plant, they're a fungus. And so they have some different capacities. They're very expansive. We tend to want to look out to the universe, but we're also very grounded. And mushrooms are, networking with their filaments under the ground, and they're very huge. They say the biggest one is like miles. It's the same mushroom network. The DNA is the same. And they tend to have a neutral spirit. Now, the things that I experience tend to be interconnectedness and earthiness. And that seems to be a common theme that people report, is a very good connection with nature. And if you think about the work that Paul Stamets does, he's really expressed that that's the job that mushrooms have, is they're connecting the trees to the ground so they can get water, and they're communicating with all the plants, and they're rooting the soil down into the ground. And so those are some of the things that I think about as being more energetic. Now, can other experiences happen? Once again, yes, other experiences can happen on any of these psychedelics based on set and setting and intention. Then we come to our cactuses, and we have peyote and San Pedro. Now, they would definitely have different flavors on an individual level. The things that are noteworthy about cactuses as plants is that they are cooling, they are mucilaginous. So we use cactuses, if you think about aloe, they're soothing. And with that, they actually have, a drying property. And we don't think about those two things being like different when we think about something wet being on us, but they can have a bit of a drying capacity. Then again, maybe it's more wet. Like I said, this is a technology that I'm suggesting. This is not set in stone. I think that they're also very grounding. I think in my experience that you are very connected to where you're at with this particular set with the mescaline. And it tends to have that grandfather masculine energy. It's stern, it's straightforward, and people tend to report well-being and a connectedness with others. A lot of times these are done in community. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the signature, this is the way, the old witches would be to say, look, they're all growing together. What does that tell me that this medicine is telling me before I even take this medicine? So that is our cactuses. And then we have LSD. Now, the thing about LSD is to remember that this is actually also a fungus derivative. Now, they are making this synthetically. So in my experience of working with energetics and non-hallucinogen plants is that when you have an extract, it automatically makes it be more of a hot, drying experience. And that's because it's really ramping up. It has the ability to really be direct, kind of like using, a knife. And so, this being in this form is kind of a high, dry, hot, um, energetic picture. Now, definitely expansive. People talk about having this is a wide open experience. You're wide awake, things you're looking outside of yourself and tend to have a lightness about the experience. The spirit energy tends to be neutral. I don't know if that's, you know, because of the experience being, an isolate, or if that's just maybe what doing, maybe an ergot mold preparation, which I don't recommend, um, would be like. So that would be something to consider. Let's talk a little bit about iboga. Now, iboga, if you think about it, is, and you can see in this picture, is a smaller plant, and the the part you're using is the root, which is under the soil, and it's cool down there, and it's very the idea of being grounded. Now, this one I can speak from experience that for me, it was a very inward experience that you're very much drawn to examine yourself versus examining the wonder of the universe. I mean, those two things happen simultaneously and on many planes at the same time, since this is a deep dive experience, but definitely something um, that people say is that this has a life review. That's why people choose to do it, is because it has a sense of looking back at things and being able to have some closure about memories. And so it deals a lot with memories. And it's more of a masculine energy traditionally. And it's that, once again, that stern grandfather figure or father figure giving you lessons versus the gentle cradling that you might have with other plants. And then we come to MDMA, and I did include a picture of sassafras. If you're not familiar, the original origin of MDMA is from sassafras. Now, we don't do that anymore, and it's not recommended because this can be very liver and kidney toxic. So it's not actually very safe to make yourself. But it does have more of a hot temperature. As far as moisture, I didn't get an impression, and because of this is a technology I'm suggesting, I couldn't find anything about what people's impressions of that were. I do feel like this is more of a contractive experience in the sense of being body aware. So once again, focus inward on the self and maybe the experience that you're having there. And then at the same time, it is an empathogen. And so empathogens are things that make us relate to others. So it's definitely more on the idea of connecting, but we are connecting with each other and ourselves, but not necessarily going out to the universe as its key characteristics. And then let's talk about ayahuasca. Now, you notice there's a lot of question marks on here. So admittedly, this is not a plant medicine that I am as familiar with. Now, the traditional way of talking about this by the indigenous people in South America is that this is a feminine energy. You'll read a lot of reports about people having an ancestor figure, generally a grandmother figure, very nurturing, and feeling like they're very much being held by that figure in an ayahuasca experience. People report being having spirit guides and coming away with a sense of purpose, and it makes sense in the plant itself, the way it grows. So coming back to the idea that this is a vine, it's holding on to another plant. It has, it's cradling it, it's, I suggest that it might be, you're expanding out, you're looking out into the universe, and that's more of an airy kind of experience, a light experience, and that it's growing up into a tree. Now, like I said earlier, these are suggestions of energetics. Energetics are not directly related to experience. We try and connect those now with modern medicine to more of a scientific side of things, but a lot of times energetic medicine is related more to like the idea of like a hunch or an instinct that's a little bit less about science and a little bit more about the whole picture and a constitution. So maybe that this gives you some ideas of how you might want to move forward with a particular energy. Maybe a particular energy calls to you more, or you feel like a particular energy would have more of a healing effect. And so when you're going through and you're reading accounts and you're trying to make these decisions, maybe, looking for these qualities that call to you beyond just a chemical composition. So speaking of chemical composition, let's talk about a little science. So I wanted to go through and give our newbies a little bit of science defined, because I want you to go out and I want you to do your own research. Research is very accessible. If you look at the bottom here, there's a link for pubmed.gov. That's where research lives on the internet. And it is a wonderful resource. A lot of times you can't read a whole journal article, but you can pay for one if you feel like it's important enough for you. But you can read over a lot of abstracts and get an idea of what kind of research is being done. You can learn about what kinds of interactions there might be. You can just see the history of what's there. And I really encourage you not to be intimidated and to go on there and look at those. They're completely accessible. And so I wanted to talk about a few different terminologies that'll help you out on that journey. And one of them is side effects. So this is a secondary, it might be planned for, it might be unplanned for, but it's not the desired effects in and of itself. So a secondary, typically undesirable effect of a treatment. So interestingly, hallucinations are a side effect of most of these drugs if you go on to a lot of websites, and it is true, but maybe not in our case because we are looking for those specifically. Contraindication. Contraindication is a very important word because that means when it's not recommended. So a drug-drug interaction is a contraindication. So if you are taking an antidepressant and it causes you to have serotonin syndrome, which we'll talk about later, then that would be a drug-drug interaction. It can be a drug-herb interaction. It can be a drug psychiatry interaction. And these are risks of your side effects. And so these are things that you can Google, whether you're talking about a drug or we're talking about a treatment or you're talking about a plant herb that you're using, is to use this terminology. And you'll get a lot more reliable websites by using this terminology too when you're doing your searches. Okay, correlation. So correlation is super important. It is the relationship that two things have together. However, it can be positive, it can be negative, and it can be false. So that being said, that two things that have correlation. So getting up in the morning and peeing is a correlation for me, because when I get up in the morning, I'm going to pee. But I also actually get up in the morning because I have to pee. It's what wakes me up. So that's a positive correlation, meaning both things are going in the same direction and there's some causation there, or they're going in the same direction and there's not causation, which would be something like ice cream and murder. This is a classic example of false correlation. But if you look up statistically that murder rates and ice cream rates both go up together on a chart, but it's a false correlation because they're both correlated to summer. So you're trying not to, eat ice cream or get murdered, maybe not being someplace where there is summer. And then recognizing that correlation does not equal causation. And that's a lot of where we struggle in the internet and the media, is that people believe that because a research study showed that people who, dyed their hair got cancer, that the hair dye caused it. And it's just not the case, just like the ice cream and the murder. Okay, active constituents or chemical constituents. This is a terminology that is used a little bit more in herbalism, and I do see it applied somewhat to hallucinogens and somewhat in medicine. Now, this is the part that generally is the element that we're looking for. It's the chemical that we've noted to be of interest. For example, in lemon essential oil, it's lemonol. In iboga, it's ibogaine. These are the chemicals that we know to cause the reaction that we think or that we want. Now, the issue with this is that it's very mitopic. We're looking at only one piece of the puzzle, and we can oftentimes miss that there might be another part of the plant in there. And so that leads us to thinking about isolates versus extract versus whole form. And these are some choices that using entheogens we have. Do we use the whole plant? Well, sometimes the whole plant is really hard to get in, and maybe there's more of a likelihood of having nausea or vomiting because we use the whole plant form. Or maybe it's such a large amount. Drinking iboga tea, it seems like there's a very large volume of the amount of tea that one would have to drink and vomit in order to have an experience. Then we have our extracts, and extracts tend to be more of a whole plant. So you're taking out a bunch of chemicals out of the plant. If you use tinctures at all, that's an extract. So you're not just getting the bearberry out of the golden seal root extract, you're getting you're getting carbohydrates, you're getting tannins, and these might have other uses. The one part about the extracts in the whole form is that they're a little bit less easy to regulate how much of your desired constituent is in there. And then we have isolates. So that's, it could be synthetically made isolates, like we're having a psilocybin that's going to be an isolate from the bacteria. We have MDMA, which is an isolate, and we have like the LSD, which is an isolate. Now, the beauty of isolates is that they're really easy to measure and really easy to control the dose. However, they don't have all the plant medicine involved. So those are some choices to think about and to know what the difference is happening and why some people may choose one versus another. So if you came here for some biochemistry, here it is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the serotonin system is the place where the majority of the interactions between these entheogens and our body happens. Now, you can see here, this is a nerve, and nerves have a small area between them where they talk to each other. And you can see at the top of the slide, we have tryptophan that turns into serotonin. You have the little packets, and then they open up and they have to float across this area. Now, this is where we use a lot of drugs, is that the drugs come into this open area and they may either block one of the receptors, that's the lock and key at the bottom, or it may decrease their ability to go back from whence they came. As you can see that some of these little blocks go back and then they get either destroyed or they get recycled depending on the chemical. You'll notice a lot of little numbers in here. Those are the specific receptors or types of pathways, you could say. And so, there's many pathways in the serotonin system. The serotonin system has, I want to say at least 24 pathways we've identified because of LSD, once again, ironically. But it's good to know that this is kind of the pathway that they're thinking about. And so realizing what part of this pathway either your medications that you're on are affecting or the substance you're trying to take. Now, I'm not going to get any deeper than that in the biochemistry part of this because they're still learning this. We don't even know. We have a lot more theories about serotonin than we really know. But what we do know is that serotonin is used for mood. It has something to do with bowel function. It affects our sleep. It can cause nausea. It has a very good indication for our bone health, our appetite, and our sexual desire. Now, why is that important? Well, the reason I bring this up is because it was only in the last decade that we found out that the majority of serotonin is made in the gut. Now, how this relates to psychedelics is that we typically think about the reaction that we're having with psychedelics being the hallucination. The experience that we're having cerebrally is the experience that we are thinking makes the changes, right? It's a psychological change. However, I think that as we move forward, we're going to find more and more how the serotonin system in other places is being affected. So, when you're taking an entheogen and you're ingesting that instead of smoking it or however else you might take it, if you're ingesting that, then the serotonin system in your gut is going to be affected. So is that going to help with IBS? There's some suggestions that that might be the case. What role does, gut bacteria and mood from the gut play with your entire body? They're finding it more and more that there's like the way you feel has to do with the way that your gut lining works and the nerves there and the serotonin and the bacteria. So moving forward, just remember that, well, diet is not necessarily going to cure the things that you're working on, is that you also need to address it because you're not going to be able to biochemically balance your changes in your mind that you want to have if you're not balancing out your gut. And that's going to be done through very specific diet changes as you go. So using that as a supportive mechanism. Just to note that, the serotonin system interacts with the dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine in our nerves as well. And some of the entheogens also work on those systems. It's a very complex, we're a very complex organism. And what we're learning is just in its infancy because we've just started studying it. The things that come out over the next couple of years and the next decade are going to be quite amazing. So, keep yourself tuned into PubMed and keep watching for what's happening so that you can continue your journeys. So let's talk about some general side effects and contraindications. Now, contraindications, again, being reasons that you might not want to do it. So nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that some of this is interpretive. These are side effects. The interpretive part is that nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, if you're going to have these from a substance, and it's a substance that is known for it, then you'll want to consider whether or not this is safe. Now, the things that I would think about as an herbalist and medical practitioner is, do you have chronic pancreatitis? Because people who have chronic pancreatitis get food poisoning and then get pancreatitis on top of that because of the stimulation that throwing up gives them. And so, people who have chronic gallbladder disease, people who have chronic pancreatitis, people who have ulcers, like these are concerns that you would want to talk to a trained medical professional about if you're going to have these side effects. Nervousness, paranoia, panic reactions. So if you're prone to these, then once again, having those accentuated and not being in an environment with the right set and setting and not having someone who is a trained professional to be able to help you deal with those is a risk and probably a contraindication. Dry mouth and sweating. Now, when I think about dry mouth and sweating, I think about your kidneys. I think about where we have fluid. Anything that either dries you out and puts you at a risk for dehydration, the nausea, vomiting, diarrhea as well, or the dry mouth and sweating. If you have, chronic kidney disease, this is something, again, that you're going to have to assess the value of your experience that you're trying to have versus the risk that you're taking in inducing a problem. Like these are things that are not being recorded because we don't have a very good accurate representation of people's usage and the side effects. And I think in the last couple decades, primarily it's been youthful people who have been experimenting with these substances. And so as we have more people, maybe you're one of them who's coming in, that you're older, you've had some health problems, maybe they're even related to some of the, mental health problems that you're working on curing, then you're going to have to consider the safety issues of other concurrent health problems that are involved. And they do consider these things when they're looking at doing research studies. If somebody is coming in and has a whole lot of health problems, they're not going to put them in a research study because they need people who have the most limited problems so that they can truly study what's happening. Increased heart rate, so people who have heart issues, pacemakers, risk of, if your doctor says that you shouldn't be out exercising or tells you that you have a risk of heart attack from sex, then, some of these entheogens might not be appropriate for you. Adulterants and wrong substance. So this is, a side effect, unfortunately, of where we're at with legalization or criminalization of drugs and the war on drugs is that, taking the wrong substance or adulterants in that can really affect us because they can give us these other side effects. So really trying to source your substances. And if you're interested in that topic, we will be offering something in January with someone who will talk about drug safety and drug checking. And then, a side effect of impaired judgment. Now, this almost sounds funny because it's the psychological effect, and you're like, yeah, sometimes I've done some things. For people who have, even just drinking, we understand that it changes our judgment. Now, being in an altered state is not in and of itself a bad thing or going to lead you to making poor choices. However, impaired judgment is why when you work with a sitter or a guide, that they will oftentimes have you sign a contract that you promise not to leave the space physically or spiritually during the session. And that's for your protection, because you could feel like you're on top of the world and drive a car and not really be in a space to do that safely. And that can, endanger your own space. And I think that has been the concern all the way along, whether or not it happens as often as the government tried to make us feel. There has definitely been people who have made bad judgments on and in an altered state and have suffered the consequences fatally. So just remembering that that's why we talk about checks and balances and set and setting. So let's go ahead and talk real quick about serotonin sickness or syndrome. Now, what happens if you think about that picture that we had is that when we're using entheogens, a lot of times they sit down on that little receptor. Now, it's like a lock and key. When the LSD sits down on that serotonin receptor, it doesn't turn the lock the same way. It's kind of like a Harry Potter lock. And suddenly it's opening it in a different direction. But what's not happening is serotonin is not able to get into that lock itself. And so it's additive. So that serotonin is going to accumulate in that little gap or in that junction. Now, that can also happen from medications. That's actually the point of SSRIs and a lot of other medications, is to make serotonin stay around longer. So with those combinations, there can be a lot of serotonin that adds up. Now, this seems to be the most prevalent side effect that people are coming in long-term suffering with, and it can be fatal. It can cause seizures. People have irregular heartbeats, and they can become unconscious. Now, it's important to know some of the signs and symptoms if you're using any of these medicines on a regular basis, or if you're, you're trying to do some neurohacking on your own, that you'd want your sitter to understand what this is for your safety. Some agitation, confusion, dilated pupils. When we're talking about loss of muscle coordination and twitching, that's kind of like a longer, it's not just like, oh, I twitched once, that's it. Don't get paranoid. some of these things can feel like they're happening in an altered state anyway. It's about a combination of these things happening. Loss of muscle coordination can also be having the diarrhea. It can be the muscle rigidity. It can be headaches. It can be uncontrolled shivering and headaches. There's, especially with MDMA, there's a lot of temperature issues that people go through. And then they drink a lot of water, and then they've, dehydrated themselves by thinning out their sodium in their blood. So just know that this is a known problem, and the risk is much higher with people who are on antipsychotic or antidepressant medications. Now, here is a guide to drug combinations. I know that you probably cannot see this on your screen. That's why I gave you the URL down below, and we can give this URL to you again. But this is a really important combination chart to look at. This is from TripSit. They've done a really great job about going through and giving you realistic warnings, saying, this doesn't have a known side effect. This has a known side effect. This is always a side effect. Do not do these things together. And so if you're on substances or you're thinking about pairing substances, go and look at this first. It's your safety. You only get to make a Darwin mistake once. And so definitely using some of the resources that they have will give you a good idea of what kinds of risks that you're taking. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Toby.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I learned a lot about energetics tonight. If you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them to Elizabeth. Until then, let me give you guys the spiel for next week. So next week is the last part of our 4-part series. So things to know before you go is the discussion points for next week. We're going to talk about intention setting, the difference between sitters and guides, some considerations around that, and then just practical considerations in general, specifically for psychedelic healing. What considerations to get the most out of your experience? How do you get the most good out of this experience? And then aftercare. And I really think that is the answer to how do you get the most good out of these experiences is in the aftercare. So I just want to say that Altered States Integration runs peer integration groups. They are a local, I guess not local, internet-based group just to talk with people about psychedelic experiences. I think sharing your own experience really helps tie narrative to the experience, and I think hearing about other people's and discoursing with them really helps you guys as well. In addition to this peer integration circle, Altered States Integration also offers one-on-one psychedelic coaching, and then we offer before and after care. Now, when I say before care, I mean intention. What do you do before your experience? And then aftercare. What do you do after your experience? How do you integrate this experience? So if you want to check out our website, all of our services are on there. We have a couple other classes coming up. We have a harm reduction class in January, and then Elizabeth has a book called Neurohacking with Iboga. That's not the title of her book, but that's what the book is about. I don't see any questions, so I'll give you guys a couple more minutes for any questions before we break. I guess I had a question, Elizabeth. I was just curious. So you talked about these energetics from your perspective. How do you think this is applicable to just people getting introduced to psychedelics? I guess you said a little bit about thinking about what kind of energetics sit with you best, but I'm just curious how like these energetics lead to somebody picking a substance.
I think that's a great question. I think that when we come to a substance, there's an intuitiveness about what we need. It's about maybe sitting at peace with your inner healer and looking at what the indications are for that. So some of the energetics that we talked about are even based in some more of the shamanic medicine that surrounds them when they were, in their advent and the tradition that goes with that. And so I think that the way that can help people is that if they feel like they have a choice, I know that many people are not going to have a choice in what kind of medicine they have. They may feel that by looking at the energetics, that it calls to them. somebody who knows that their own personal constitution, thinking about the energetics of their own constitution, you know, and assessing that as a personality is a really great place to start for change anyway. So, you know, going through and being like, yeah, I'm a person who tends to be real high energy. So maybe being with a substance that's more high energy is not ideal for them. In most of these medicines, energetically, what we're looking to do is to balance it out. So if you think about holding a plate in your hand and being on one side of that plate and putting pressure, you know, it's going to tip to that one side. So if you have a lot of wet and phlegmy energy, which is me, then when I think about constitutional medicine from an herbalist state, is that I want to dry out my constitution. So I tend to choose herbal medicine that is more drying, because when we look at even herbs, the list of things that herbs can do is amazing. You can find 20 herbs that you can use for eczema, but which one do I choose? Well, I choose the herb that matches my constitution. I pick the herb that's going to be a little bit more dry and hot because I'm cold and wet. And that idea is that you're putting that pressure more and more to the center of that plate, which is where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to the middle. We're not trying to get to any extreme. And so by thinking about what your personal constitution is, and maybe what part of that constitution is pulling you in one direction or another, that we want to move the other direction. And that's a lot of times that's really uncomfortable. We're like, oh, well, I'm used to being quiet and calm and grounded, but maybe the thing that we need is what's going to bring out that energy, that fierceness, that interconnectedness, that boldness that that can give us relief from, you know, maybe being trodden on because we're a little bit more quiet. And so thinking about what your personal energetics with, and then matching it with whether that's, you know, medicine or lifestyle. You can think about constitutional and energetic medicine being transposed on a lot of different things instead of just being like, oh, biochemically this does this thing. Well, you know, there's a gazillion antidepressants out there. There's, you know, you can go buy 35 essential oils from the store. They're all antimicrobial. Which one do you actually want? And so maybe looking at those and trying to pair those up to look for more balance.
Cool. Thank you so much. That's a very interesting perspective I don't necessarily think I've thought of before. So I appreciate your perspective as a herbalist. All right, guys, I think that's all the time we got. Sorry for going over tonight. We just had a deep dive tonight. Appreciate you guys all for coming. Hope to see you guys same time next week for the last week of our class, and online for one of our peer integration groups or for some one-on-one psychedelic coaching. Thank you guys so much for everything. Hope to see you around.